showing up so bright and early on a Sunday morning. We'd like to welcome you to the session. Here with us today are Ahmed Rashid, whose books Taliban and Descent into Chaos have made their way onto everyone's reading list since 2001. Ahmed Rashid is also a very accomplished journalist who continues to contribute to several places, including the BBC. We have also with us Amit Chaudhuri, who is a fiction writer who is, as he just recently told me, temporarily moved into nonfiction. His most recent work is Calcutta, 2 Years in the City, which has been described as equal parts realism, equal parts sort of half-part story, and a sad-eyed memoir, which I think sounds very interesting. And we also have with us Michael Dwyer, who runs Hearst Publishers, and their catalogue includes authors such as David Kilcullen and Lauren Geyer, and they specialize in global affairs, conflict, international relations, and religion. We also have with us H.M. Naqvi, who is the author of Homeboy, which won the DSE Literature Prize, and he's also veered into nonfiction, most recently with the profile of Jameel Yusuf in Karachi, who founded the Citizens Police Liaison Committee. And it's a lovely profile available in Caravan magazine. So thank you all for joining us here today. I'd just like to sort of start with the discussion, maybe with Amit, maybe with Amit and HM, to talk about, you're both fiction writers who also dabble in nonfiction. And I wanted to talk about how does it feel like that writing process in terms of...
I'm just sipping the coffee.
And HM will start. How does it feel like, and what do you think of, for example, the importance of fiction in this nonfiction world?
The importance of non-fiction in a fiction world. You know, I find that fiction and non-fiction complement each other in reifying reality. And so, for instance, one can scan the headlines in the morning, in the dailies, and get a sense of what's happening in my city, which is Karachi. And that's one way of going about figuring out what's happening. Another way is to read fiction that the city has generated. There's this neat little axiom that I enjoy spouting, that fiction is a lie that tells the truth. And so in that way, I think fiction has its own sort of power and resonance, and that newspaper reports sometimes are not always sufficient. Amit Chaudhuri, are you done with your coffee?
Kind of, making progress.
Amit, would you like to add anything to that as a fiction writer?
To the coffee?
Well, also to the coffee.
Yeah. Fiction in a non-fiction world.
Well, just about also...
I was trying to figure that out. We do live in a non-fiction world, I think.
Right.
Yes.
But also about, as a fiction writer and moving into non-fiction, how has that been sort of, as a writer, the process as well? I mean, you said that you've also written essays, so it's constantly been going on, but how do you feel the response has been, obviously, as an author, when you've been known as a fiction
Firstly, I mean, is the question a marketing question connected with what publishers are up to, publishing more non-fiction?
No, I'm just asking as a writer.
Huh?
As a writer, how does it feel
writer.
to move from fiction to non-fiction?
Well, you know, firstly, when I started writing fiction, and I said this, I was on an earlier panel right here, so I feel like I'm repeating myself. But very well, then I repeat myself, to paraphrase Walt Whitman. He says, do I contradict myself? Very well, I contradict myself. So, when I began to write and published my first novel in 1991, A Strange and Sublime Address, my preoccupation was, how do I write about the ordinary? How do I write about eventlessness? How do I write about things which are set in an exceptional city, when I use the word in various ways, like Calcutta, but I don't feel I respond to for the exceptionalism, but for the humdrum qualities, for the quotidian qualities. How do I write about this in a kind of, in parameters that have been defined suddenly from a novel that was then published 10 years earlier, Midnight's Children? Okay? So against the backdrop of that of writing about great histories and the history of independent India. How do I do what I am up to? And so firstly, I was writing a fiction which in any case was not typically what was supposed to be Indian fiction. So when you use these generic words, then they break up.
Right.
And then I began to gradually write essays. They turned out to be a project. I didn't begin them as such, to explain my position and also to say, look, I am what I am because also there's a history to that kind of writing in world writing, but also in Indian writing, in the writing in the languages. So it was while discovering that genealogy that I gradually began to write essays to begin with. And later on, we can come back to it, there were other reasons for writing non-fiction.
Absolutely, but that's very interesting that you mentioned that normally I think that's a problem with non-fiction, that you have to compare yourself to the work that's been done in non-fiction before. I'm sure if somebody now wants to write about the Afghan Taliban, they would look at Ahmed Rashid's book or some of the books that Michael has published at Hearst, but for that same element to come into fiction writing, I think is very interesting.
It's a very, very sort of big thing in any kind of creative activity. What has happened before? Am I going to follow it or am I going to do something else? It's not because you want to do something else, but for God's sake, we would all like to be part of the same bandwagon. It's much easier. But if you are not, then what do you do about it?
Right. My next question is for both Ahmed Rashid and Michael Dwyer. I wanted to talk to you about, especially in relation to Afghanistan, it's a country that has been imagined in Pakistan in particular through anecdotes and from various relatives who may have traveled in the 70s or 80s, or through television visuals. And when you publish non-fiction work about the country, is it difficult to sort of, when you bring it out, is it difficult to sort of match up to the expectations that people already have of Afghanistan? Do they imagine it, is it easy for them to accept the work that you're doing, given that they already have very preset and preconceived notions of this, even though non-fiction about Afghanistan is supposed to inform our understanding of the country?
Well, I think it's one of the publisher's responsibilities to challenge those preconceptions, obviously. And as a publisher too, I find when you're dealing with areas in conflict like Afghanistan, just to take that example, the utility of publishing non-fiction blurs the boundary self-evidently, because you are challenging narratives which have real power, and especially in societies where the fictional literary canon is not known, shall we say, in the West. The role of biography, autobiography, and other non-fiction forms can, I think, advance understanding far more effectively than other forms. I mean, we published the first autobiography of a member of the Taliban, and received quite a lot of criticism for it at the time, because I think it was an initiative that people weren't yet ready for, and then followed that up with a book of poetry of the Taliban. But I've received more compliments from members of the military complex in America and the UK about publishing those books than any other sector, because they felt deceived by their governments, expending blood and treasure, losing friends and colleagues, fighting an enemy that nobody, least of all in their governments, had explained to them who these people were, what their imaginary hinterlands are, and how they came to be presenting themselves against them in the field of battle. So I wouldn't for one moment espouse their cause, but I think it was foolish that we spent a decade without trying to get into their heads, and given the absence of a fictional tradition translatable from Pashto into English, publishing those two books, I think, advanced understanding, and then, augmented by books like Jamil Ahmed's and others, where you really get into the location, the landscape.
Absolutely. Mr.
Before I answer your question, I just want to make a few general points. The first thing is that there's no doubt that people are reading less and less non-fiction. it's very difficult to get people to read a book on the politics of Iran or Afghanistan or the Middle East. And that's unfortunate, because I really think that to understand an issue in which we are living in, a problem, you've got to get some background, you've got to know some history, you should know some sociology, some anthropology, and good books, good non-fiction books will give you all that. For example, on Afghanistan, when I wrote my Taliban book in 2000, I mean, it was the result of already 18 years of reportage from Afghanistan and traveling with the Taliban and getting to know them. And I mean, that, you know, so the book included a lot of history, a lot of anthropology, a lot of discussion on religion and all these things. And you can't get these from newspaper articles or anything else. But I will say the other side of the coin is that a lot of fiction today is about weird and wonderful things, which we would not normally read about. So, for example, there are books about African books which are being translated. There's a novel about North Korea that has just come out. There are novels about the Mexican drug cartel, which are probably the best description of the Mexican drug cartel that's ever been done. So people are going into fiction to read about the world that they live in. So even as non-fiction goes down, fiction itself is becoming a version of non-fiction. And finally, if you look at Afghanistan, it's very difficult to get people now to read books on Afghanistan because, you know, so much has been written, etc. But, you know, the best-selling book on Afghanistan is a novel, The Kite Fly. It's not a non-fiction book. The Kite Fly sold like 8-9 million copies.
Kite Runner.
Huh?
Kite Runner.
Kite Runner, sorry, Kite Runner. And it's still selling. So, and your idea is perfectly right. I mean, one thing I do, you know, there have been a lot of books that touch, novels that touch on Afghanistan. And they're very, I mean, Nadeem Aslam has written about Afghanistan, Kamala Shamsi has written about Afghanistan, you know, or brought Afghanistan into their novels, and many Western writers have done the same thing. And I always look for, you know, I want to see that authenticity about Afghanistan. And in many instances it's missing. You know, either because these authors have just traveled there once, or they made a quick trip to Kabul, or whatever it is. And I think, you know, even to write a novel about weird, wonderful places, you have to be authentic, and the only way to do that is to live there, to be there, to, you know, actually understand the psyche of the people you're writing about.
I think that's obviously an interesting point, but we've been debating this in several other panels for the past 2 days, whether you need to live in a city to be actually able to write about it. And yesterday at KNE's Ahmed session, we discussed this in great detail. But also, based on what you're saying, also I wanted to ask, is there also more pressure now on non-fiction authors to write in a fictional style? Like, obviously, My Life with the Taliban, the reason it's such a gripping read, it's because it's such a compellingly told story. It's a non-fiction story, but told like a fiction book, you know, with its twists and turns, and there's a great amount of drama and suspense about what happens. So as a publisher, Michael, do you feel like there is a pressure to sort of make non-fiction books more interesting or more dramatic, shall we say, to appeal to people who would necessarily not pick up a non-fiction book?
I don't feel any pressure to make them more dramatic, no. To improve them as works of literature, of course, yes. But also, even with the case of My Life with the Taliban, you're dealing with a text which is entirely unverifiable, even though you can visit the places where Mullah Abdul Salam Zaif grew up, speak to some of his contemporaries. It's essentially a fable that's presented as his life to his interlocutors, which we published. You have to take a huge amount on trust, but as a publisher, because it's an unverifiable text, I don't feel anxiety about having published it, nor would I have felt anxiety about having published Ryszard Kapuscinski. You know, he said, I'm unfortunately a poor writer who lacks the imagination of a writer, and about him was coined the phrase by Adam Hochschild, I think, magic journalism. I grew up reading Kapuscinski, especially on Africa, and other places that he reported from. And I think he recalibrated the entire way of reporting, quote unquote, reporting on current affairs because one was aware at the time, even subconsciously, that the embellishment, the style of narrative, the characterization, which we now know from the biography of him and some investigative work into his career, there were many elements of fable in those constructions. But they certainly brought home and convinced people of the need to understand what was going on in Angola or Ethiopia, even though the stories he spun were in many ways unreliable ones.
Right. One thing I also wanted to talk about is in terms of non-fiction, in terms of fictional accounts of real events, such as I think most noticeably in Pakistan, A Case of Exploding Mangoes, which takes a conspiracy theory about General Zia-ul-Haq's death and bases the book on it. And now that book and its popularity have sort of replaced the official version on how Zia died. Now, if you ask someone how he died, they'll very sort of straight-faced tell you, oh, there was a crate of mangoes placed on the plane, and that's what happened. Even though, before this book came out, there were sort of 20 dozen sort of conspiracy theories about this. So this idea that, this fiction book, and maybe in countries like Pakistan, where obviously, the lack of history or the lack of information available about how the state functioned in the 70s or 80s, there's a dearth of it. Do you think that, fiction plays a more important role in sort of trying to give, answers to these difficult questions that we haven't been able to solve as a country? Obviously, this is a more Pakistan-specific thing, but I'm not sure if this happens in India or other places as well, where a fiction book kind of replaces the official narrative, or it answers kind of questions that you would like to have heard from the state in the first place.
I don't know. I mean, this is not something that I have spent too much time thinking about. Maybe I can talk to you about things I have spent time thinking about.
Sure.
I mean, because the question again comes back to fiction and non-fiction, and somebody who practices both. What are we doing? What do these generic terms, fiction and non-fiction, mean? What makes us shift from one to the other? What do we lose when we shift from one to the other? So, as I said in my answer to the earlier question, I had a specific idea of why I went to fiction, but not for the usual reasons, not to just tell stories, portray characters, although those are not incompatible with what I'm doing. But one of the things that I was always uncomfortable with, let's say two things. Since we've been, you also asked me earlier question, do you need to make your non-fictional works more fictional? And you're talking about a particular kind of non-fiction. In my case, when I write, or whether I write fiction or non-fiction, what I'm trying to do is similar, although each genre will open up certain possibilities, which is, what I'm trying to do is make something out of nothing. See if, without working with big themes, you work with something quite small, which for some reason presents to you itself as an occasion for exploration, or it seems significant to you. Can one do that? Can one pull it off? So that preoccupies me both as a fiction writer and as a non-fiction writer. But as a fiction writer, I was always unhappy with what Virginia Woolf called the awful business of the realist novelist, having to describe what happens between breakfast and dinner. So you're caught in a certain linear narrative in a certain kind of novel. So one of the reasons you might move to the essay or other forms of non-fiction is to escape that. You may not escape it into non-fiction if you go down again that fictionalizing route of actually having to reproduce reality. But you might want to go away from reproducing reality in that particular way that Naipaul said, making made-up stories or writing about what happened between breakfast and dinner, and thereby move towards the non-fictional. You might realign your fictional method to make it like that as well. There's another quote from the French writer Roland Barthes, quoting another writer, Paul Valéry. Paul Valéry, the poet, says, all novels begin with a sentence like, the Marchioness went out at 5 o'clock. So when you read a sentence like that, the Martianist went out at 5 o'clock, you know you're in the unreal time of novels, histories, and cosmogonies. So he equates a particular kind of novel with history writing as well. It's also, you can pursue it in history writing. Raja Ram Mohan Rai was standing in 1786 and looking out, it was raining, etc. You're in that unreal time. And he says that opening in the simple past tense is how he identifies it, plunges the narrative into an unreal time that suppresses what he calls, in French, but in English, the trembling of existence. So I think we are all trying to go towards the ragged, towards things which don't completely fit in. At least I am, when I'm looking towards both these forms, fiction and non-fiction.
Absolutely.
Can I weigh in here?
Sorry?
Can I weigh in here?
Please go ahead.
This is somewhat too esoteric for me. The way I work, for instance, is I think I fundamentally lack imagination. So I have to rely on reality to construct my fiction.
Guys, tomorrow's headline, H.M. Naqvi lacks imagination.
So, for instance, in Homeboy, our young hero loses his job and is compelled to drive a taxi. He becomes a New York cabbie. And Homeboy is not a memoir. I haven't ever driven a cab. And so to recreate that ethos, that sensibility, I had to spend time with cab drivers. So I spent 18-hour shifts sitting shotgun with the cab driver. I ate where they ate, in dhabas in Coney Island and Jackson Heights, having nihari and halim, dishes that can sustain them through these shifts. I slept where they slept, and sort of was able to put this research in service of fiction. So the relationship of fiction and non-fiction for me is integral to the way I construct my novels. In my second novel, the novel that I hope to complete sometime this year, although that's the same thing I said last year, it's a novel set in Karachi, and parts of Karachi, although I hail from Karachi, the parts of Karachi is ever expanding, and the swaths of Karachi that I don't have a visceral sense of. So I actually walked around the streets, making investigations, much like you, Sabah Imtiaz, you crack journalist, and trying to get a sense of how things function. For instance, I went to Liari, and the only time I could enter Liari was when the Soccer World Cup was taking place. Uzair Baloch had declared Pax Liariana and had set up these massive screens, and the young the ruffians and the miscreants and were championing Spain over the Netherlands. And I asked them, for instance, why Spain? They had Spain, they had the Inquisition there, they threw out all the Muslims and the Jews. And they said, हाँ मगर उनमें फिर भी थोड़ा मुसलमान खून है.
Well, just sort of on that note, is it because, why did you have to do your own investigation into this is also a question. I'm not asking why you, but because there is sort of non-fiction work about Karachi. Michael's publishing a wonderful book about Karachi by Dwyer and Dwyer, and which will sort of deal with a lot of these issues. And for example, even with, let's say, racial profiling in New York, now there's been an excellent investigation by Associated Press on how racial profiling was done by the New York Police Department. Now, had those things existed, or let's say have Lawrence's book came out before you wrote the novel, or had this AP investigation existed, would you have relied on these non-fiction sources for your fiction book, or would you still have gone out and done, done your own reporting, as it may be?
For that part of Homeboy, when our young heroes are detained, I actually spoke with NGOs, NGOs who are working with prisoners detained in the sweeps that followed 9/11, and I actually also conducted a couple of interviews with people who were detained. And so if I had the AP stories, and they're fabulous, groundbreaking stories, because New York seems to have become a police state, I would still need to hear the tenor of the voice, the timbre, when they relate these stories to me. And even today, when I'm working on my novel in Karachi, there are enough sources, there are enough primary sources for me to go on, but I prefer oral histories.
Right. Please go ahead.
I just want to say a few things about Pakistani writers. You raised the issue of Muhammad Hanif. I think Hanif is a brilliant writer because he's Pakistan's first satirical writer. We don't have a tradition of satire. There is some satire in Urdu writing, but the first time in English you've got a really authentic, satirical, hysterically funny writer. But I think the other thing we should note about if you look at the major Pakistani writers like Mohsin Hamid, Hanif, Shamsi, what you see is that this generation too, like my generation, is completely wrapped up in politics because there's been one huge crisis after another. And they've had to live through these crises, even though many of these young writers have been living abroad or have been studying abroad or whatever the case. Your book is about New York. But I think all our writers are deeply aware of the political crisis we are going through. And through all their fiction, you get this. I mean, Hanif chose to write about Zia ul-Haq. You can't get more sort of political than that. And Mohsin kind of recreates his own world, which is also intensely political and social about how society is functioning or not functioning, as is the case. And Kamla Shamsi is writing historical novels which brings in Afghanistan and jihad and partition and all these big political issues. So I think all our writers, mashallah, thank God, are very deeply rooted in the politics of what's going on around them. And I think that's what makes their writing great.
One of the things that I find very interesting about sort of the mix with fiction and non-fiction is, let's say also with the Zia thing and sort of it replacing official narrative, but also when sort of smaller factual details in fictional books kind of become popular. I was talking to somebody last night and they said, one of the interesting things about when you write a fiction book is that people start trying to Google up the story mentioned in it to see if it actually happened. Or what's happening with The Goldfinch now, a book by Donna Tartt, which is doing exceptionally well abroad, and it's about a painting in a gallery in New York, and now people are flocking to see this painting that's mentioned in the book. And Michael, I was wondering, as a publisher, has this ever happened where a fiction book mentions a non-fiction event and sort of it helps people gravitate towards non-fiction that way?
We did publish a history of the only attested all-female regiment, which was a warrior regiment in Dahomey who fought the French in the late 1890s. And the book's called Amazons of Black Sparta, which I think is a great title for the book. And we probably sold about 500 copies. And then Stieg Larsson, in the middle of the trilogy, footnoted the book, and in his 3 volumes he only mentions or recommends his readers to read one book, and it's this book. So sales went through the roof, and the power of the imaginative writer, I mean just the marketing pulling power to push a book, to rescue it from oblivion, quite remarkable for a non-fiction publisher to see the word of mouth, and how I think recommendations of fiction works differently from the way that one passes on news of non-fiction books. But as a publisher too, I think it's easy to get blasé about the distinction between fiction and non-fiction. And as a non-fiction publisher, you have to bear in mind that a lot of your more tenacious authors are researching and writing material which, at the time, may be perceived as fiction. I mean, you have to think back to Stanley and Livingstone writing about Africa in the late 19th century, to Solzhenitsyn writing about the Soviet Union in the early 70s. Just cast your mind back about what the perceptions were. And of course, with all those writers and many others, it transpired that what seemed in many respects fictional turned out to be entirely true. And the more books that I, as a publisher, can release which, again, challenge the established narrative and unsettle, the better. And when our books are sort of slated for their accuracy, and then in the fullness of time, it transpires that the writer was on the money, that gives me a real thrill.
Well, I suppose it's good advice to all fiction authors that they should footnote a non-fiction book and help the non-fiction authors out as well. Amit, you talked about labeling and about labels of fiction and non-fiction. And one of the interesting things, I mean, especially if you go into a bookstore, is that, you know, fiction is sort of divided into humor and romance and you know, South Asian, which I find delightfully ambiguous because, you know, South Asian, just everyone's together. You never see that with American or European, but also that non-fiction is such a vast category, apparently, that where it encompasses everything from a cookbook to a self-help book to an oral history of the Taliban, for example. When you talk about these labels, do you think it's a disservice to non-fiction that it's kind of just treated as one big category with everything in it?
No, I mean, I suppose it can't be helped, but firstly, non-fiction is a sort of slightly undesirable category because it's defined by fiction, by being by not being fiction. Yeah, as I said earlier, I mean that there is a historical kind of novel, there is a historical non-fiction, and there is a different kind of non-fiction which explores other things. So yeah, non-fiction doesn't cover everything, just as fiction doesn't. I think, you know, I cannot speak for what's going on in Pakistan and you know what the intellectual orthodoxy over here is. I have no idea, or I have less idea than what it is in India.
It's okay. I don't think most people in Pakistan have any idea either.
But I think in India, I mean, you mentioned bookshops, you mentioned genres. I know that according to a survey done in the year 2010 maybe, in Tehelka, they found, at least among the sampled readership with which they did the survey, that 98% of Indian readers read books for self-improvement, only 2% for pleasure. So we're looking at a kind of readership which is thinking, even if they don't experience books in that way, are thinking in terms of books, in terms of serious issues and things like that.
Obviously, because self-help itself includes so many serious issues, including personal.
And there is a tendency in India for fiction to be read almost as a form of non-fiction, where, you know, if non-fiction is sociological and addresses sociological issues or is a branch of the social sciences, often Indian novels are spoken of in the same way. That they're significant because they deal with certain issues that are deemed legitimate by the social sciences since 1947.
Well, absolutely, and this is the point I was trying to make about how fiction books tend to replace or tend to add to our knowledge of a place or of an event or of a country, and I think that's the case obviously with Afghanistan. When you talk about the Kite Runner, a lot of people imagine Afghanistan to be through the eyes of Khalid Hosseini and his book, and that and A Thousand Splendid Suns. And do you find that it's a problem when you're sort of talking about your books? Do you feel that you often get this question, but no, I read in a fiction book that it must be like this?
Yeah, I mean, Afghanistan has been in the public eye for the last, 14 years now with the Americans there, etc. So, I mean, there's been an enormous amount of literature about Afghanistan, and people have formed an image of the country as much through the New York Times as through this famous novel, which has, affected a lot of people. But I just want to say that I think the real problem is now that, I wish people would go back to reading nonfiction, because that is something that is really required in the world we live in today. Of course, another form of nonfiction that I think is becoming very popular and is perfectly legitimate is blogging. For example, a lot of the Arab Spring has been covered most effectively not by journalists writing in newspapers, but by blogs of local people, Egyptians, Tunisians, wherever it may be. And these blogs have circulated amongst the diaspora, and then it's reached other people. And in fact, I think several publishers are putting together some of these blogs. And these are, day-to-day blogging about political events, demonstrations in the streets, and all the rest of it. And I think, this is also a major contribution to nonfiction. But nevertheless, I still think we need books. We need to understand what is going on with a historical perspective.
Yes, buy more books, people, please do. I also want to talk, it's actually interesting you brought up blogs, because I was thinking at the same time that while people may not be reading as much nonfiction, as you say, but there's also a greater interest in reading long-form journalism, which sort of is obviously shorter nonfiction. It's more readable in that it's a compellingly told story. And HM, having just written a long-form profile of Jamil Yusuf yourself, did you find that it combined sort of both your abilities as a storyteller, as well as the fact that you had to fact check and write this based on interviews that were not going to be fictionalized?
This in a way that in the same way that I draw on oral histories or oral accounts in my fiction, I sat with Jamil Yusuf. I was meant to sit for half an hour. I spent 3 days with him. I wound up spending 3 days with him. And I had to think about how to construct a narrative, a cogent narrative. And the discussions with the editors of Caravan, this piece was published in Caravan, and a fabulous magazine in India. The discussions with them were of the nature where they were pushing back. They said, you have to, you're telling a story like a storyteller. And I'm like, well, I am a storyteller. They're like, yeah, but we need to know, for instance, what month the CPLC was born. CPLC being a sort of, it can be described as a gentleman's league to fight crime. And I said, well, it's irrelevant what month it was born. From a storyteller's perspective, the drama is not, the drama is in how this man who was a businessman learned how to fight crime. This man who had no background in crime fighting suddenly was entering the dens of kidnappers with his pistol cocked. There's the drama. And of course, there's great drama in his involvement with Daniel Pearl's, the Daniel Pearl episode, and how Jamil Yusuf was about this far from actually figuring it out. And so there was this back and forth, and it was a very unusual, it was a very different process from dealing with my editors when I'm writing books. It was very interesting and illuminating for me. Those guys are very good, and they had their, they had a point that from a perspective of reportage, I need to get certain facts out there. But to me, if the CPLC was born in August or born in January, it's irrelevant to me.
It's irrelevant to you. Obviously, most editors and journalists would think otherwise, as I'm sure Michael would, as a publisher of non-fiction books. Thank you so much for this lovely discussion. We're now going to open the floor to questions in case somebody would like to ask something. So, yes, thank you. Now you can actually see people and maybe their hands. Does anyone have a question? We can pass the mic around.
Yes, I do. We've been talking about fiction and non-fiction. Have you been talking about a third back and forthing from both perspectives? Is there to be a third form to be born from this of writing, which doesn't define itself as either fiction or non-fiction?
Anyone like to sort of...
I think it's been around for a very long time, actually. Kapuscinski being a great example.
Anyone else would like to add on to that?
Absolutely. I mean, the writing is full of such instances. I mean, for instance, I mean, I can only think for some reason of one right now, but there are millions. Jeff Dyer's Out of Sheer Rage, for instance. It is a piece of imaginative writing. To call it either fiction or non-fiction, it could have been passed off as a novel. So, you know, so yeah, the question, the most interesting question lies in the blurring and the approach you take towards imagination and fact. I think that's, but I have to say that there are things you can do with non-fiction which you can't with fiction, and vice versa, even for a writer who is trying to blur the divisions. So to give you one example, my fifth book, The Immortals, is about a young upper middle class boy flirting with the idea of learning Hindustani classical music. But he's growing up in a very privileged world with very romantic and modern notions of what the artist should be doing. So while he admires his teacher, his guru in Indian classical music, he doesn't understand why his teacher wants to feel so comfortable in a world teaching rich people, which he, the young man himself, romantically despises without giving up any of its privileges. Now, it was possible for me to tap into the boy's real anguish and distaste for that world of privilege he was growing up in, and mock him at the same time for not giving up any of his privileges in that world. It's something that the novel allows you to do. If I had written of that same material as an essay, I could not have had that dual tonality in what I was writing. I could have talked about it, but I couldn't have shown it in that dual way where I am both tapping into the sincerity of his message, you know, have nothing to do with this world. In effect, he's saying to his guru, while at the same time mocking him. That is something that a certain fictional kind of narrative allows you to do.
Thank you. Anyone else have a question? Can we get a mic here, please, in the second row in the middle?
Hello.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Hold on a second. Just hold on a second, because I sort of saw her first.
Yeah.
But yes, please go ahead.
How would you define the difference between fiction and non-fiction then?
Right, so the question was, to a student of literature, how would you define the difference between fiction and non-fiction? To a student of literature, how would you define the difference between fiction and non-fiction?
Well, you know, fiction is something imagined. It comes out of your imagination. Non-fiction is a part, you know, a number of things such as history, sociology, the study of human behavior, etc., etc. But fiction is something that is, you know, does come out of your imagination. I think the other great writer who's merged this, what Shaista was asking just now, is of course Gabriel Garcia Marquez. because his writing on Latin America, for example, about coup d'etats and dictators and imaginary worlds, etc., actually mixes up fiction and non-fiction. He writes about real historical events and fictionalizes them in an absolutely beautiful way. So I think, that has always been a very popular genre of writing.
I mean, even outside reportage, which is a genre of its own, I mean, I don't check every time my better non-fiction writers, who are mostly academics, for the mise-en-scene, those that fancy themselves with a literary bent, you can't ask them, which way was the sun slanting as you entered the Legislative Council building in Accra on that day 5 years ago. So you take an awful lot on trust working with an author, and that's why the editor-publisher or author-publisher relationship is still a very, I think, personal and intimate one in a way, because if you start questioning the framing of non-fiction even, you just have to give up. You just have to take it on trust.
And that's very important. Sorry, there was some guy here who had a mic.
Can I just add about this fiction, non-fiction
Yes,
question?
please go ahead.
What would you say to your students? I mean, firstly, let's say, hang on, shelf that question for the time being. Think about imaginative writing and other kinds of writing. And whether you're pursuing what's loosely called fiction or non-fiction when you're writing imaginatively, remember in imaginative writing is a form of writing that cannot, where the language or the form or what is produced is not totally defined by its subject. That is, if you're writing about politics as an imaginative writer, you're writing about much more. If you're writing about a chair as an imaginative writer or a room, you're writing about much more. There is no guarantee that that is all you're writing about. So there's no guarantee that just by writing about politics in imaginative writing, you are going to be political. There is no guarantee that by not writing about politics, you are not political. Some of the most interesting political writing might have no overt political content. Just as Borges says the same thing about cultural identity. He says, we know that he's arguing that there is no easy marker for Argentinian writing. Just by putting lots of Argentina in it doesn't make it Argentinian, which is borne out by his own writing. So he says, you look at the Quran, there are no camels in the Quran. It is a sure sign that it is an Arab text. If it were not an Arab text, we would have camels. There don't need to be camels in the Quran. So what he's saying is, do not look for easy markers in imaginative writing for what makes what it is.
It's interesting you brought that up, because I believe there's a whole thing about how the camels were inserted into the Bible and they didn't exist there in the first place. The guy here with the mic, yes.
So it's a generally agreed upon fact that every developed writer...
Could you introduce yourselves?
My name is Malik. I'm a student at LUMS, and basically I am an aspiring writer. So I have a question that it's generally agreed upon that every developed writer has a voice, a writing voice. So when writing non-fiction, you try to remove yourself and try to write a very third-party account. Would that be a correct assumption? And if it is, what advice would you give to aspiring writers to then remove their voice and write from this third perspective, this third party's perspective?
It's, in a way, it's quite an incisive. What you're suggesting is somewhat incisive, because one way of thinking about the difference between fiction and non-fiction is coming at it from matters of construction. So, if you write an article, the conceit is to write in the third person. And there's this sort of semblance of objectivity in the third person. But if you were, as an exercise, an intellectual exercise, rewrite an article by inserting yourself in it, it becomes the texture of the reality of that piece changes, and you are sort of attuned to the fact that this is actually a version of reality. And so, this particular session in 3 different papers will be depicted 3 different ways. There'll be emphasis here, emphasis there. And if each writer, each journalist were to actually insert themselves and say, well, I thought that, the panel was full of shit, that is a depiction of their reality. And so one has to think about construction and the semblance of truth, the semblance of fiction, the semblance of non-fiction.
Excellent. Will anyone want to add to that?
To bring in yourself when you're writing non-fiction is something that I like doing. I wanted to address critical questions, but not do it in an academic way.
Right.
So I wanted to be able to talk about the world in which a thought process was occurring, but which also included a cup of coffee. So that the world in which the thought process is occurring is also the world in which I had the cup of coffee, and be able to write in a way that in a form that would allow that to happen, because in an academic piece I would not be able to mention myself or the cup of coffee. But there is a tendency to elide oneself, especially I sometimes think in Indian non-fiction writing. The complexity of where one comes from, what one's social aspirations are, is muffled under this kind of persona. And I sometimes think that one interesting example of such a persona is Ved Mehta, a very charming and interesting blind writer who in his writing always pretended as if he could see the world perfectly around him. Something I think was lost by that construction. But that construction is only an echo of what keeps happening in Indian non-fiction. That we pretend the world is completely seeable or knowable, partly because we ourselves are not present in it. The moment you're present in it, various things break up.
Also, just to add to that, I think because of the way obviously the internet is now, if you read a piece, whether it's in a newspaper or whether you read a book and you know nothing about the authors, you picked it up because it had a flashy cover and maybe the words Iran or Central Asia or something emblazoned on it. But now it's very easy to sort of just run a search in Google and find out everything you know about that author. And so sometimes a lot of that also informs your opinion of the book, is that if you've read a book on I don't know, history of Pakistan or whatever, and you don't know what the author's sort of personal convictions are, so you can always Google them up and find out, what did they say at XYZ seminar, what did they say at a Lit Fest, or what else have they written, and you can kind of conjure your own image of the person writing it, and that, when you reread the book, it kind of reflects on it as well. I'm sure a lot of people who must have read your first book didn't know anything about you at that time, and if anyone's picking it up now, will now know all of the work that you've done before, and will have sort of some idea of what Ahmed Rashid looks like and what he says otherwise, and what his views are on Pakistani politics or on Afghanistan in general. Do we have another question?
Yeah,
yes.
Over here.
I just have a comment. I'm actually reading Ahmed Rashid's books. I just finished Descent into Chaos, and now I'm reading Taliban. And looking at what's happening in Pakistan, I thought I should have read the books a long time ago, but I'm reading them right now and they're making more sense to me than they would have a few years ago. And looking at what's happening in Pakistan and what the government is trying to do and what the army is trying to do and how people are responding to the narrative about the Taliban, it's helped me a great deal to read the books written by somebody who has in-depth knowledge of the area, of the region, who has been going there for the last 30 years. And who's familiar with the culture, with the history, with the sociological, ideological, geographical, and all sorts of background on Afghanistan. And I just wanted to thank him for writing the books.
Okay.
I'm blushing.
Yes, do we have another question?
Yeah, I do. Actually, this session has been very helpful, but there's something that was missing in there, and I would bring it up. Basically, nowadays, the non-fiction and fiction, they have merged. For example, Reza Aslan, the Iranian writer, he was in Riverside, and he did his master's in fiction, and then he went about writing non-fiction. So basically, as an academician also, I would emphasize the fact, and I would like to ask you also, being a fiction writer, it gives you a hold on a lot of imagination and lots of dimensions, and it'll effectively make you a very effective writer in history also. So I think that is the millennium, this millennium's new genre. You know, fiction helping you gear up for a very interesting, captivating historical perspective.
No, absolutely, and I think in my discussions before with all of the panelists, Michael, for example, mentioned that his favorite books on South Asia are novels, not non-fiction, and Ahmed Rashid was saying the exact same thing about how much he loves fiction. So I think it's also very important for everyone who even works in non-fiction to read a lot of fiction, because it does inform the way you write. Do we have another question? There's somebody. Oh, I'm not even sure what you're saying.
Yes, I have a question.
Yes.
Here. I'm Talal Raza, and my question is that what I infer from this whole discussion is that fiction provides an easy escape to write on controversial issues without getting censored. So do you agree with this notion that you can write on controversial issues without getting censored, especially in a country where religion is a very controversial issue and people get sentimental on this? What are your views on that? Thank you.
In the last month, the major book that has been censored is a book on Hinduism. It's Wendy Doenger's book, and so there are, and it's a book of non-fiction, and so there are sort of sensibilities in South Asia, and not peculiar to South Asia, that whether you treat it in fiction or non-fiction, there are lobbies, there are groups that will take offense. So censorship becomes a tricky subject, and I don't think fiction or non-fiction can you can escape from such scrutiny in either genre.
All right, I think that's all the time we have for questions. Thank you so much. I'm sorry. I'm sure you can grab one of these authors later, and Michael, and grab them. Thank you so much for being here. What do I want to do? No, I'm going.
Yeah, there's a Kite Runner. Get on. It's by Donald Guy, and it's social history.